but you have to leave yours on. Everyone, we think of poets as rock stars. That's why we usually have, as you both know, hundreds in the audience, but tonight we have a select few, and we have a great audience out there in our Zoom webinar. I'm sorry we can't see you. I love seeing the people on the Zoom, but it is a webinar, and we're doing what is asked of us. So, welcome to the first Harold Clurman Poetry Reading Series event. Thank you to Nina Capelli. Yes! Yes. Thank you, Nina Capelli Oppenheim, who's our Director of Cultural Programming, and to Libby J. Vera, whose production team continues to solve all of our problems. Thank you, Libby and Addison. We are in person and on Zoom tonight, and how grateful we are to introduce in person Mark Doty as our 2021 Poet in Residence. Yes. And there is more. And to have this glorious poet, Marie Howe, join us tonight. Thank you, Marie. Unfortunately, Yusef Komanyaka will not be joining us tonight. However, do not despair. I will be sending everyone a link of his interview about Walt Whitman. So you will be getting his take on all of this. The Stella Adler Studio Center for the Arts has not stopped producing evenings like this and expanding into new realms. Under the artful guidance of our artistic director, Tom Oppenheim, who believes that arts justice is the big umbrella under which art, poetry, music, dance, and theater humanizes us. And to that end, I encourage you all to visit our website to see what we've been up to. Tonight, we gather to celebrate the wondrous book. If I had another hand, I would pick up the book. Pick up that book. Oh, Marie's, there it is. There it is, this wonderful book, What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life by Mark Doty. And to discuss Whitman and hear his voice carried on through these extraordinary poets. So please sit back at home and here in Theater 4 and prepare to feel as Walt Whitman did and the Stella Adler Center of the Arts does. I am large. I contain multitudes. Mark Doty, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, I want to tell you first that this is actually my first in-person reading with a live audience in almost 2 years. And it's a deal for me. We all were isolated in various ways during the last 18 months or 2 years. For me, the depth of that isolation came in not being able to do this, not being able to connect with readers, to see people face to face and to talk about what I'd done and how what I'd made might have touched them. I don't know any place else that the courage of poets comes from, really, except from the responses of readers. You can win prizes, you can publish in great magazines, you can publish books, and it's not quite something there to hold on to, really, as good as those things are. What we can hold on to is the person who says, you said how I felt, or I know what you mean in that poem. Nobody ever really said that before that I've read. So that is the thing which sustains courage and faith in this work. So thank you for this opportunity to do this, especially here because this is either it's been my fourth time I've read Stella Adler, more than that, and it's been amazing. The responsiveness of this group of people, the investment that your peers make, and I'm sure you do too, in what you're hearing, what you're thinking about, what you're struggling with, is deeply moving to me and sustaining. Okay, so it really feels like a wonderful thing to celebrate this book here. And this book was published in April of 2020. So we were all a little distracted at that time, and it felt like nobody noticed, and I'm not surprised that they didn't. There were great reviews, there were responses from individual readers, but I never got to do this, to just talk to people about it. And so in some way, tonight is the actual launch of this book. We're sending it out. So in order to do that, I've invited one of my best friends in the world, a remarkable poet, a remarkable thinker, a human being of great spark, great resonance, a Whitmanian poet. Please welcome Marie Howe.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay,
so we're gonna go back and forth. Maria's gonna read a bit, some Whitman and some whatever herself, and I'm gonna do the same thing, and then we'll talk and invite you to talk with us.
So I just want to say it's so great to see you all. It really is. The energy in this room could light up the whole building. It's so great to be with you in person and to see you all. Thank you for being here. I love Mark. I love what he has done with his life and his work. And Whitman is maybe one of the first poet, maybe the first poet who just gripped me. I teach eco-poetry now in my classes, and which only means that we're really paying attention to the living world. And everything Whitman says is true. And he knew it so long ago. He really knew that that every molecule belonging to me, or actually every atom belonging to me really is as good belongs to you. If you think about that, it changes everything, you know? So I think that we talked about maybe we should read a little Whitman first. So the man himself. But what I want to say, have you all read this? Has any of you read this book yet? Right? I mean, it's almost too hot to handle, you know? I mean, not only Whitman's vision, I think Whitman actually saw into reality, you know? I mean, he saw into it. He saw it, and then he wrote about it, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to remember it, you know? And meanwhile, his life went on, and his own personal life, which Mark really speaks about in here. But to have someone see into the fabric of reality as we live it, but we glimpse every once in a while, is just astonishing. So we talked about, so confused because of all these books. Well, the beginning. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. How many of you have loafed recently? Do you loaf? I don't loaf nearly enough. But then many, many things happen, but we get to, a child said to me, what is the grass? And so Mark and I were thinking of trying to read this together, doing a swath. So he's lying on the grass, right? He's thinking about well, everything. And so I've got a strange bookmark because I grabbed it from my office, and it may not even be the same version, but a child said to me, what is the grass? Fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is, any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Do you have it?
Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name somewhere in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose?
Or I guess the grass is itself a child, a produced babe of the vegetation.
Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic growing among the produce herb of the vegetation. And it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among whites, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same. I receive them the same.
And now it seems to me the beautiful, uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are the mother's laps.
This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive, after all, so many uttering tongues, and I perceive that they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing.
I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and the old men? And what do you think has become of the women and the children?
They are alive and well somewhere. Smallest sprout shows there is really no death, and if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and cease the moment life appeared.
All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. So, you want so Whitman tried. Whitman identified with every single thing in the world. He identified with every animal, with every person, with every growing thing, and back in those days, of course, people were not buried as we are now. Now we have chemicals put in our bodies. We're most of the time surrounded by lead put into the ground, so the body never even disintegrates into the earth again. These are boxes of people put right under the earth, and so the hair of the grass is really almost like the hair of the real body. He's the most physical poet. The anaphora, of course, over and over again, you know, the questions, the answers. When I was, as I say, I've been trying to understand the new science, you know, and been reading those books like Physics for People in a Hurry and, you know, who's that wonderful Carlos Ravalli, you know, eight lessons in physics. And I was watching, you know, tried to read the Stephen Hawking's book, which is so difficult except for the last page. And I became really kind of obsessed with the notion of Hawking's, you know, and people, once we got that big telescope, we could see that the galaxies were all moving apart from each other. And so they came up with this idea of the singularity, that once everything that is was this tiny, 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 tinier than your thumbnail matter that blew up into everything that is. That's called the singularity. Maybe you know that already. I didn't know that until a few years ago. So this is a poem called The Singularity after Stephen Hawking's. And you'll hear the Whitman, a little Whitman in it, I hope. Do you sometimes want to wake up to the singularity we once were? So compact, nobody needed a bed or food or money. Nobody hiding in the school bathroom or home alone, pulling open the drawer where the pills are kept. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Remember, there was no nature, no them, no test to determine if the elephant grieves her calf or if the coral reef feels pain. Trashed oceans don't speak English or Farsi or French. Would that we could wake up to what we were when we were ocean. And before that, to when sky was earth and animal was energy and rock was liquid and stars were space and space was not at all, nothing. Before we came to believe humans were so important, before this awful loneliness. Can molecules recall it, what once was, before anything happened? No I, no we, no one, no was, no verb, no noun, only a tiny, tiny dot brimming with is, is all, everything, home. Thanks. So during the pandemic shutdown, some of you, I'm sure, were in the city here, and it was so strange, wasn't it? How quiet it was. Who was in New York during the shutdown? It was just a few of us. Yeah, it was so silent. No subways, no airplanes. That constant hum that is New York, no matter what time of day it is, was just off. And no one on the street during the really severe shutdown there. And I remember waking up and hearing bird song for the first time in New York City, like really being woken by bird song and hearing sirens. And somehow those sirens and bird song, were the major sounds of the day and silence. So this poem got written, and it's from the pandemic, and it's called What the Silence Said. Do you still believe in borders now? Birds soar over your maps and walls, and always have. You might have watched how the smoke from your own fires traveled on wind you couldn't see, wafting over the valley and up and over the hills and over the next valley and the next hill. Did you not hear the animals howl and sing? Or hear the silence of the animals no longer singing? Now you know what it is to be afraid. You think this is a dream? It is not a dream. You think this is a theoretical question? What do you love more than what you imagine is your singular life? The water grows clearer, the swans settle and float there. Are you willing to take your place in the forest again, to become loam and bark, to be a leaf falling from a great height, to be the worm who eats the leaf and the bird who eats the worm? Look at the sky. Are you willing to be the sky again? You think this lesson is too hard for you. You want the timeout to end. You want to go to the movies as before, to sit and to eat with your friends. It can end now, but not in the way you imagine. You know, the mind that has been talking to you for so long, the mind that can explain everything? Don't listen. You were once a citizen of a country called I don't know. Remember the burning boat that brought you there? Climb in. Thank you.
Fantastic poems. Well, I'm going to read you a bit of Whitman, this one for a couple of reasons. One, because Whitman is the poet of New York City. He made everything else that people have to say about the city possible. And he did that because he is the first poet writing in English to actually love cities.
Yeah.
The romantics said, it's dirty, it's too industrial, people are suffering here. William Wordsworth thought London looked best at dawn when nobody was awake. If you look at the bridge. Blake said, I wandered in the charted streets near where the charted Thames doth flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So seeing all that sorrow, Whitman comes to the city, young man from out on Long Island, and suddenly finds this world of possibility where people are creating themselves, people are living in new ways, and he cannot help but be delighted to join them. So this is a bit of a masterpiece of his, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He loved to ride back and forth from home in Brooklyn into Manhattan. The ferry went just where Brooklyn Bridge is now, And in this poem, he imagines speaking to people in the future who will be riding that ferry. It's an amazing thing for a poet of the past to reach toward us. And Whitman is always trying to reach through the page. He says, I was tired of the cold type and paper between us. I wanted you to touch me. I wanted to touch you. So this is a bit about riding the ferry.
He's talking to us
Yep.
right now.
Yep. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. I project myself. Also, I return. I am with you and know how it is. Just as you feel when you look on this river and sky, so I felt. Just as any of you is one of a living crowd, I was one of a crowd. Just as you are refreshed by the gladness of the river and the bright flow, I was refreshed. Just as you stand and lean on the rail, yet hurry with the swift current, I stood, yet was hurried. Just as you look on the numberless mass of ships and the thick-stemmed pipes of steamboats, I looked. I, too, many and many a time crossed the river, the sun half an hour high. I watched the 12th-month seagulls. I saw them high in the air, floating with motionless wings, oscillating their bodies. I saw how the gleaming yellow lit up parts of their bodies and left the rest in strong shadow. I saw the slow wheeling circles and the gradual edging toward the south. I, too, saw the reflection of the summer sky in the water, and my eyes dazzled by the shimmering track of beams, looked at the fine centrifugal spokes of light around the shape of my head in the sunlit water, looked on the haze of the hills southward and southwestward, looked on the vapor as it flew in fleeces tinged with violet, looked toward the lower bay to notice the arriving ships, saw their approach, saw aboard those that were near me, saw the white sails of schooners and sloops, saw the ships at anchor, the sailors at work in the rigging, or outstride the spars, the round masts, the swinging motion of the hulls, the slender serpentine pennants, the large and small steamers in motion, the pilots in their pilot houses, the white wake left by the passage, the quick, tremulous whirl of the wheels, the flags of all nations, the falling of them at sunset, the scalloped-edged waves of the twilight, the ladled cups, the frolicsome crests and glistening. These, and all else, were to me the same as they are to you. I project myself a moment to tell you, also I return. I loved well these cities. I loved well the stately and rapid river. The men and women I see were all near to me, others the same. Others who look back on me because I look forward to them. The time will come, though I stop here today and tonight.
Oh,
Those who look back on me because I looked forward to them. I feel like all my life I've been looking back toward him, not knowing that he was there looking back. It's an extraordinary way for a poet to reach toward us. Whitman, in some ways, had no audience. He self-published his first book at the age of 35. That poem was written when he was 36, and he's putting himself among the dead. He says, I was one of the crowd. He's already sort of passed over to talk to readers in the future. That first book, he printed an edition of 700 copies. We know that he gave away a good many of them. We don't know for a fact that he sold any. It was for sale in a local, like the equivalent of a sort of New Age bookstore. You could order it from Whitman himself. It was a big, oversized book and made to be sort of on the parlor coffee table. He thought that would help it sell. Inside, there was no author's name on the book. Years later, a young man asked him, Mr. Whitman, why didn't you put your name on your book? And he said, it would have been like putting a name on the universe. Because the poem wanted to hold everything. It did not want to belong to Walt Whitman. It wanted to belong to us in totality. He also had an engraving of himself, no name, but you can see a picture of him. And he was concerned with the size of the bulge in his trousers in the engraving. And we know he changed it in some of the books. We don't know if he made it bigger or smaller. And it's an interesting question. Did he want to be more prominently masculine, or did he want to soft pedal this? I think he probably made it bigger, knowing Whitman's poems. So one of the things that comes with feeling that you are connected, that you are there with those in the future, that you are there with everyone at this moment, all our atoms together, is a sense of social responsibility. You can read about 20 pages into Song of Myself, his great epic poem, before he ever mentions anything political. And when he gets around to it, this is what he says. In that passage, What is the Grass? He says, I think it is a uniform hieroglyphic growing among black folks as well as among white. I give them this, and he talks about Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. Canucks are Canadians, Tuckahoe, an Indian tribe, Congressman, we know about those. He didn't like him much. Cuff is a slang word, 19th century word for African American. Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. So the grass gives itself to everyone equally, no matter what color they are, and receives them, that is, takes their bodies in when they die, just the same. The grass he's interested in is not the neatly manicured grass of kept graves, but the wild grass, the unkempt hair of graves, he says. Where are the unkempt graves? Everywhere. We have lived on this planet long enough that there is nowhere that human remains are not in some way, that human dust is not part of this world. So to embrace the dead is to embrace all of the earth, to place value upon them, to know that they are continually recycled, brought back again. He says, to die is different than anyone has supposed, and luckier. To him, to die is just to be recycled, to fall into the great cycle of matter. There is nothing he thinks better than that, no other place, nothing else to be celebrated except that perpetual participation here in matter. So if that's true, then we are that much more responsible to one another. We are truly equal. And, the least of us, the most troubled of us, deserves our attention, our caring, our work to intervene. So this is a poem that is Whitmanic, a new poem of mine. I've never read this before, which means should you ever encounter it again, it may have changed, I don't know. But it's a poem that wants to think about the fate of a person you probably know this name, Sandra Bland, a woman who was stopped in Texas. Black woman who was stopped by a police officer on an empty road and suffered accordingly. I guess that's all I need to tell you. It's called Light You Up. When the patrol car came barreling behind her on a 4-lane northwest of Houston, she moved into the left lane as the law required, but didn't think to signal, and so provided the officer with a reason to do what he wanted, to turn his flashers and siren on and pull her over off the blacktop, edge of an empty road, shoulder curving into a ditch, then up into an untended field. You know her heart sank. Behind the steering wheel, Sandra Bland lit a cigarette. I won't name the officer. Why should I? No one but a man with nothing to lift himself but rage. Molten lead poured from the besieged fortress he is, just who you think he is, hot-headed, less muscled than he was, ex-military, ex-security guard, cop who lost 2 jobs before the one he's about to lose now. Any woman afraid of him, any immigrant, man or woman of color, queer man or woman, I'm afraid of him. On his video, the parts he didn't destroy and the state didn't hide, and what she shot on her phone before he knocked it to the ground, you can hear his voice barely holding down whatever's about to explode from him, almost hear his eyes shine with the force of his will to make her obey. She failed to signal. She wouldn't put out her cigarette. Signals by smoking that she won't leave the thin sphere of her defense, won't get out of the car. She is not capitulating, though she knows she's going to. How do I know what she knows? You know as well as I do. The old story played out over and over. He wants her to know her place, which is beneath him, which is out of the car. And then he says unmistakably, clearly, what I who can exile him from nothing, from no mercy but my own, would not forgive him or anyone, even if we're each the sum of a lifetime's damages. Don't we choose whether we pass that harm along? They'll take away her medicine. In a few days' time, she'll be dead by her inner cell, by her own hand, they'll say. But whether or not he ever touched it, you and I know whose fingerprints are on that rope. He touched the trigger of the taser, his stun gun, childish name for such an unthinkable draft of pain. She'll get out of the car. She'll put out that cigarette, anything he said, because what he holds in his hand soars past anywhere words could go. He was readiness. I think he loved that brink, the vertiginous edge of it. He said to her the words that joined hands with any harm ever done to him. I'm going to light you up. That is what the origin said to the fresh darkness of a vast and already beloved creation. The first words ever spoken. Our first parents lived in Eden, a Hebrew scholar told me. One day only, perhaps a day of biblical proportions, and late afternoon sun was shining into the garden by the time they stood naked beneath the forbidden tree, grasping at leaves to cover themselves, though from the omnipresent eyesight there was no hiding. And as they were ushered out of the gates, a little wind nipping at their heels, the desert around Eden cooled as the sun did something they had never imagined, sinking into a smoky red, dropping away as if it couldn't bear to look at them. The first night. Was this darkness immortal? What did it want from them? In a patch of stones and nettles, they wept. Nothing to wear but leaves, Impossible to walk when brambles tore at them. How could they rest when animals they couldn't see wandered in the dark and they couldn't find the other's hand? Then the black dome above them lightened at the edges to a warm gray, and a sun they didn't know they'd ever see again. Was it the same sun? Began its upward climb behind the mountain before them. They understood. Even out of Eden, the cold would be dispelled. Those shapes that had troubled them in darkness would be made plain. And if they lost their way or one another, there could be recognition and reunion come morning. And if that star, just then coming into view, had paused in its transit over the new minted world, the man and woman shivering in the field below, as its light moved toward their upturned faces, if that sun could speak, what do you think it would have said?
If that sun could speak, what do you think it would have said?
Yeah. So I want to calm down. The poem shakes me up. I'm going to read you another poem, which is about it has to do with the pleasure of being in community and the possibility of what we can do together that you can't do by yourself. So some years ago, I was living in Provincetown at the end of Cape Cod, quite isolated place in the winter, and the local choral society decided to do a performance of Handel's Messiah. And it was exciting, but it was also a little daunting. Like, it was a small group. I don't know how the instrumentalists would fare. I'm not sure they could handle this thing. So I went with some trepidation. And when I got there to the church where the performance was taking place, there was this incredible sunset hanging up over the roof. And I thought, if I stay out here, I know that's going to be beautiful. And if I go in, we'll see. This is called Messiah, Christmas portions. And there's one word you might not know, which is melisma. Melisma is when you hold a one sound over many notes, like Gloria, that kind of thing. Okay, here we go. Messiah, Christmas portions. A little heat caught in gleaming rags, in shrouds of veil, torn and sunshot swaddlings. Over the Methodist roof, two clouds propose a Zion of their own, blazing colors of tarnish on copper. Against the steely close of a coastal afternoon, December, while under the steeple, the choral society prepares to perform Messiah, pouring in their best black and whites onto the rake stage. Not steep, really, but from here, the first pew, there a looming cloud bank of familiar angels, that neighbor who fights operatically with her girlfriend, for one, and the friendly bearded clerk from the post office, tenor trapped in the body of a baritone, altos from the A&P, sopranos from the t-shirt shop. Today, they're all poised, costume and purpose, delivering the right note of distance and formality. Silence in the hall, anticipatory, as if we're all about to open a gift we're not sure we'll like. How could they compete with sunset's burnished oratorio? Thoughts which vanish when the violins begin. Who'd have thought they'd be so good? Every valley, proclaims the solo tenor, a sleek blonde I've seen somewhere before, the liquor store, shall be exalted. And in its handsome mouth, the word is lifted and opened into more syllables than we could count. Central ah dilated in a Baroque melisma, liquefied. The pour of a voice seems to make the unplaned landscape. The text predicts the Lord will heighten and tame. This music demonstrates what it claims. Glory shall be revealed. If art's acceptable evidence, shouldn't what lies behind the world be at least as beautiful as the human voice? The tenors lack confidence, and the soloists, half of them anyway, don't have the strength to found the mighty kingdoms these passages propose. But the chorus, altogether, equals my burning clouds, and seems itself to burn, commingled powers deeded to a larger, centering claim. These aren't anyone we know. Choiring dissolves familiarity in an outpouring rush, which will not rest, will not for a moment be still. Aren't we enlarged by the scale of what we're able to desire? Everything, the choir insists, might flame. Inside these wrappings burns another, brighter life, quickened now by song. Hear how it cascades in overlapping, lapidary waves of praise. Still time to change. So we would be delighted to talk with you about Whitman questions you have about him, about our work, wherever you'd like to go with this. Yes.
Wait, I'm sorry, just a moment. Our audience on Zoom won't hear you, so I have to be like the game show host.
Okay.
And who's speaking? Come, maybe we could. Oh, great. Here you go, darling.
In the poem, I think it was Walt Whitman's, I think, yeah, where he used you said it was a racial slur, the C word for black people?
Oh, yeah, not a slur, it's slang word.
Cuff.
Yeah, cuff.
Slang, okay.
Cuff.
Then never mind.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know that until, I had to go look it up. It's a term that's totally dropped out of use as far as I know, and I don't know what its origin is.
It might have been, we don't know the tone.
It might have been, right. But I sort of doubted he would have employed a slur. Later on in his life, he said or wrote some really questionable things about race. I think he had lost the acumen that he had as a younger man. He had a stroke. He was nervous about his public perception. He always wanted to be part of things, part of whatever was fashionable. And so he made some statements, kind of Darwinian statements about race and evolution that were just out to lunch. He had the sense to cancel it. It was for a little pamphlet called Democratic Vistas, and he canceled it from the text before it was published, but the copy survived. And it's just damning, and there's no excuse for it. He lost his vision, which is so weird because in his first edition, Saw Myself, of Leaves of Grass, there is a poem called I Sing the Body Electric, and in it, Whitman's character goes to a slave auction, and he delivers this monologue that is just scalding. He twice says, I'm going to help the auctioneer because he's no good at his work. And he says to the people, very kind of bitter irony, he says to the audience at the auction, the bidders, you could not possibly pay enough money for this man. There is nothing you could offer that would come near his worth. And you don't know but that his blood runs in your veins and your blood runs in his, and he's going to wind up being a king or an emperor, and what will you be? I mean, he just tears that audience up. And it startles me that some people emphasize the racist statement he made later without noticing that this poem from 1855 is as ferocious an anti-racist poem as his century produced. So he said famously, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. And he certainly contradicted himself about race, no doubt.
Mark, do you know, I read a book once on Whitman and Lincoln. Have you ever read that book?
Some of
It's
read about those
it's
two.
very interesting. He was sort of in love with Lincoln. He thought Lincoln was just such a great man. And when he was in Washington tending the wounded who were brought there during the Civil War, he would stand on the street corner when he knew Lincoln was going to ride in the morning with his little boy. And instead of Secret Service guys, he had Secret Service guys, but they were all on horses. And so there would be this sort of arrow of men around him. And after Lincoln died, I didn't know this, Walt Whitman went on stage and created, through Lincoln's speeches, the Lincoln because Lincoln was hated at the time. A lot of people didn't like him at all. But he went on stage as Lincoln and did these speeches and talks and went around and did this. And he sort of created the character we think of now as Abraham Lincoln from what he had written.
I think that there was some element of atonement in that because when the Civil War broke out, Whitman was just, I don't want to use the word patriotic, he was jingoistic. He was out cheering the troops on. Those days, all the young men from one region would go together. So people were joining up in Brooklyn and marching. And his poems about heading off to war are appalling. They're about, let's go out there and do battle. His brother then, who was sort of a higher up in the Union Army, a minor official, disappeared. And Whitman was sent by his family down to look for him. So he takes a train down to DC and then he travels into Virginia where the battles were. And what he found changed his attitude entirely. He talks about seeing these piles of amputated limbs outside the makeshift clinics. He was horrified by the fate of soldiers. It just hadn't been able to foresee that physicality somehow. So he winds up, living in DC doing volunteer work in these horrendous hospitals, which contain both Confederate and Union soldiers. You imagine these hospitals are makeshift wards. There are no antibiotics, no sulfa drugs. The theory of sterilization of instruments is still some time away. These are hellholes, these hospitals. People are suffering there profoundly. And there's Walt every day with some candy, with some oranges that he gives away pieces of, and he writes letters for people, and he reads for those who can't read. And it was horrifying for him. I mean, he loved those boys, but it also just kind of broke his health. It was deeply painful.
And many of them, of course, were dying.
Yes,
because they just died.
Sometimes right next to him. He had believed in his earlier work that we could have a democracy founded on the love of comrades. And what happens to the love of comrades? They tear each other to pieces.
Mark, can you just talk? I just have to say, this book is a lot. There are sections of this book, the sources, which I think was extremely amazing to do. But can you talk about the queer Walt Whitman?
Sure.
Because it's a really a radical book in talking about queerness and how there wasn't a word for it, and how what that implies.
I mean, it's not like people made up a new kind of sex act, in the 19th century. It's that a category of identity began to appear, which had not appeared before. The word homosexual appears in print before the word heterosexual does. Heterosexual doesn't show up until like 1880s because there was not a perceived need for a category. So Whitman came of age, he was born in 1819, in the 1840s was really his formative years. The 1840s were a little bit like we think of the 1960s. It was a time when people believed that human nature could be changed and bettered. So there are all these movements of nudism, free love, vegetarian diets, the high fiber diet invented by Dr. Graham of graham cracker fame, communal living, feminism, on and on it goes. So Whitman's just in the middle of this. There was a bar in lower Manhattan called Pfaff's that he loved. And he would hang out. It was known as a very bohemian bar. And people there were publishing, they were arguing. It was just this hotbed of new thinking. That began to cool as the Civil War approached and as something else happened, which is that psychology began to medicalize the personality. If you could define what was normal and abnormal, you gained a certain degree of control or mastery. And in order to define normal, you start saying what's abnormal. Whitman himself was a great believer in this cult of pseudoscience, of phrenology, where you studied the bumps on your head, and the bumps were supposed to tell you about your personality. So you could have a bump that indicated how loyal you were, how friendly you were, how sexual you were. The phrenologists thought that if you worked on whatever this issue was, you could change your bumps. You could make them grow. That idea fell aside in psychology when people like Krafft Ebing, various European psychologists began to say that, well, if you were a habitual masturbator, your eyes might be too close together, or a sloping forehead indicated a lack of intelligence. And this gets really mixed up with racism too. So description of faces that are inadequate or reflect the inferior. So that's going on at the same time as New York, in particular, and other cities are really changing in their character because the jobs in the country dried up and farming wasn't in great shape. So hordes of young people come into New York City. Between 1800 and 1850, the population of the city just multiplies like crazy. Young men are living together in rooming houses, in apartments that are very crowded. People are looking for diversion. And part of the result of this is an evolution of a sexual culture that's really different. Street cruising, a sort of local places, bars known for places where you could meet like-minded souls. There is amazingly a guide published which leads you to various locations of sin, and it points them out specifically so you can avoid the one that offers the kind of sin that you like. Yeah, right. If you believe that. So Whitman is clearly, tons of textual evidence as well as historical evidence too, that he's totally erotically drawn to men. When he writes about women, it's all reproduction, childbirth, all, gushing milk and how strong, great
Mothers.
athletic mothers they
Mothers.
are. Right. When he writes about men, it's all the fireman's muscles bulging through their trousers and sexy and alluring. So he had a number of relationships, usually with younger men. It was not uncommon in that time for men of older established men to take young men in as boarders, often share bed with them. So there's a young man named Fred Vaughn who lived with him for a number of years and clearly was crazy in love with him. Whitman wrote poems in Calamus, a marvelous homoerotic sequence about Fred. He also encouraged Fred to go and get married and have children because he thought Fred was a little too emotional. There was too much work for him. And Fred did. And 10 years later, Fred writes this letter to Whitman, which is quoted in the book in its entirety. It's the most heartbreaking thing you'll read. Fred is sitting alone at lunch in an empty shipyard. He's looking around, and everything he sees reminds him of Walt. And he's thinking about their deep friendship and how the poem and how Fred and he were talking the poem and how much he misses that. It's just the saddest letter in the world. He says, he says, so I'll give you this last little bit of it. So what's happening? Okay, let me find Fred.
I live in the West Village in an old tenement building, and there's one, my studio on the third floor actually has no kitchen and no bathroom, and the bathroom's still in the hall. And all the men who worked in the shipyards in the West Side, they would live in like my apartment, which is a railroad apartment, and there might be 10 men living and just sleeping there, not cooking, but sleeping there, and they would use the bathroom in the hall, and then they would go to work every day. So this was very common, that just guys would all bunk together. But what was interesting was Mark was talking about how if there's no word for homosexuality, it's not made, certainly it's not criminal, and it's not made, what's the word I'm looking for? It just, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, it's not named,
Aberrant.
it's not spoken. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's out on the margin somewhere.
It just is. This is in these days, men and women, well, I don't think women, but men actually swam in our rivers. Can you imagine? You just after work, you just take off your clothes and go swimming. That's how clean and clear things were.
And if you decided to have sex with another man, it did not make you queer or a homosexual or a faggot or whatever. It's just something you did. It was a behavior as opposed to an identity.
Exactly.
It's very hard for us to really conceptualize that because we have all grown up, everybody in this room, with this
identities.
This binary. You're gay or you're straight. That's one of the things you judge. You look at another person, you say man or woman, and you say gay or straight. And it's hard for us to erase that barrier and
Well,
to
that's
imagine.
what's beginning to break down now.
It is indeed. People
Among
your age are
you
breaking
all.
down, which is thrilling.
Excuse me, I'd like to invite our Zoom audience. I'm just going to run over here. I'm going to try not to lasso the two of you and see if anybody has a thought on the chat or a question. I don't see any questions here just yet, but
If I
I'll
may,
keep an
Ben,
eye on it. So
I'll just add a word about that last question.
Yes.
So Whitman is writing the poems of a new way of being. He knows that he's a man attracted to other men. He's giving that form. He's imagining a society in the future where that will be totally acceptable. In his Calamus poems, he talks about a city of robust love that he thinks will rise, presumably in New York. He is making something brand new, even though there is no audience for it. So imagine, there's no word for your category of identity. You believe you are a person of this sort. You are writing the poems that speak to the future, and yet there's nobody there. He's calling his audience into being, which is something you also hear him doing in the Brooklyn Ferry poem. Men and women of a generation hence. My poems are for you. What I make is for you. And it's remarkable. It's very hard to imagine being able to do that. Can you actually project yourself into a future that has changed from where we are now and speak to people who will be living in another way? It's extraordinary.
This is what we all have to do. We have to begin to speak to the future from here, believing they're listening to us, right? And there is that remarkable moment in crossing Brooklyn Ferry where he says, it's happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
What I talked about before, it's happening. And we're reading, and we're thinking, yes, it is happening.
Yes, right.
It is happening. Yeah. Holy shit. And it's like the hair stands up in the back of your neck when he says, it's happening, isn't it? Like and you're like, yes. And it comes to be because he's reached out. And no one's reached out like that. I mean, Keats reaches out in some way, this living hand, but Whitman is like, I was here, you're here, I see you, I hear you. And I was thinking, like, for all of us in the arts, if we could throw out the dystopias that we're fed every single day by our culture. Every day. How many times have we seen New York destroyed, right? Destroyed. The Statue of Liberty holding her torch on the water up to here. But if we imagined a future where the planet had survived and actually thrived, as well as imagining this world of friendship and comradeship, men and women, all different kinds of people. Friendship is this great thing too, like real friendship and love of the earth, love of the earth.
He
Love
announced
of
that
them.
in part by just speaking to one person at a time or singing to you. You holding this book.
Yeah.
Stop with me this day and night, and you shall possess the secret of all poems. I stop somewhere waiting for you. The you and you and you,
You.
is accumulating a
I
human
and thou.
community,
I and
a
you.
society of friends.
Let's see. I think, Mark, you might have answered this. What was Whitman's attitude toward women?
Oh, she had great women friends.
Yes.
A woman named well, her publishing name was Fanny Fern, very popular newspaper columnist, sort of kind of a feminist, advice on women, for women how to survive, being a housekeeper, being responsible for a family. And she published a book called Leaves from Fanny's Garden, something like that. It was such a popular book that she made something like $60,000,
Yeah,
in the 1850s. Enough money for her to get a townhouse in Brooklyn and be set up for life. Whitman was so impressed that he copied the design of her book for the first edition of Leaves of Grass. He also, she wrote a hilarious review of the book, which talks about the pendulous swelling fruits hanging down that we can pick and taste. And it's clear that she's aware of this bulging crotch thing. And it's a joke between them. So her whole review is a kind of a hilarious nudge of the ribs.
Tell the story about Thoreau and her and the other guy visiting Whitman, and then Thoreau like having enough of it. Was it Thoreau?
Bronson Alcott.
That's it.
Yeah,
same family, same town.
More the same.
Yeah.
Thoreau was really annoyed. He went to visit Whitman, and when they left, he's walking back to the ferry, and all these people say, "Hey, Walt, how are you? Good to see you, Walt." And Thoreau's like, "Yeah, no poet should be as popular. No poet should have friends like this."
Everybody was always saying hi to Walt. But Thoreau and Emerson, Emerson called for the American poet, and Whitman hears it and writes this amazing poem, and they all think he's amazing until they meet him. And then they're like, he's a little much, because they're all so civilized out there in Concord.
Yeah. Emerson had spoken in New York, 1840-something. Whitman was in the audience, and here's Emerson calling out, "Where's the American poet? The poet of this great, vast continent who will use our language, not imitate European models." And Whitman's out there listening, taking all this in. When he's finished his book, he sends a copy to Emerson, who reads it and loves it and writes back to him and says, "This is the greatest bit of wit and wisdom America has yet produced." And Whitman takes that letter and pastes it on the back of his second edition without permission. Emerson's really
A blurb.
angry. Yeah, it's a big blurb from a very famous man. And he's angry in part because he thinks that Whitman's going over the edge about sex. Whitman is just too sexual. And readers at this time, curiously, never seem to talk about the homoerotic content. It's just too much heterosexual congress in here. It's just disgusting. And Thoreau said the book could have been written by a beast. One of the reviewers for a New York paper said these were the poems of a sentimental donkey. Whitman was fired from a job he had working in the Department of Agriculture because his boss read Leaves of Grass and thought it was just too smutty. But they're never talking about homosexual sex. They're talking about heterosexual intercourse that they think is too graphically portrayed.
Anybody else? I know so many of the students read your book, Mark. Everyone's very quiet tonight.
Feel free. You can go wherever you want to with it. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you read that
Can I do what?
that one that you were gonna read? The Fred. What is it? Fred? Freddie? Fred?
I can't hear you.
I couldn't hear you. Sorry. Mask.
Fred's.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh,
Okay.
Fern's letter?
This is Fred's letter. This is
Fred.
Whitman's former lover. This is 10 years
yeah.
later. So
He's
Walt.
a father now, right?
Yeah, he's a father. He's got 3 kids, but he's not living with them. Walt, driver hour. I loafing in a lumber yard at foot of 35th Street under the shade of a pile of lumber and sitting on a lower pile. Opposite and close to me at the pier head a bark. In the fore-rigging, flapping lazily in the summer breeze are a few sailors' clothes. From the galley pipe between the main and the foremost issues a cloud of smoke. One of the men in blue shirt and barefooted has just come from a loft where he has been loosening the mainsail, which seems to be wet. He is now gone below, I suppose, to his dinner. On the opposite side of the river, Williamsburg, between the every plying ferry boats, the tugs, the Harlem boats, and mingled with the splash of the paddle wheels, the murmur of the sailors at dinner, the lazy flap of the sails, the screech of the steam whistle of the tugs, the laugh and wrangle of the boys in swimming, comes the remembrance of thee, dear Walt. With Williamsburg and Brooklyn, with the ferries and the vessels, with the lumber piles and the docks, from among all, out of all, connected with all, and yet distinct from all, arises thee, dear Walt. Walt, my life has turned out a poor, miserable failure. I am not a drunkard nor a teetotaler. I am neither honest nor dishonest. I have my family in Brooklyn, and I'm supporting them. I never stole, robbed, cheated, nor defrauded any person out of anything, and yet I feel that I have not been honest to myself, my family, nor my friends. 1 o'clock. The bark is laden with coal and the carts have come. The old, old poem waltz. The cart backs up, the bucket comes up full and goes down empty. The men argue and swear. The wind blows the coal dust over man and beast, and now it reaches me. Fred Vaughn.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
sounds like a Whitman poem, that
yeah.
whole
Wait.
first part when he's saying everything he sees and hears.
You know, when you read that letter that he read Whitman's poems, that Whitman read to him, you hear the cadences, right? The accumulation of details, and then that and the old, old poem waltz.
We do have a question here,
Yes.
and that is, why does Whitman use a blade of grass to symbolize his poems?
Oh, well, because I mean, you think about a natural metaphor, a metaphor that seems inevitable in a way. The grass sprouts everywhere. It doesn't really need so much from us, although, you know, in our suburban American lawns, we do a lot of intervention. Grass is a grass. What is grass? Okay, is it one blade? Is that grass? Or do you have to have a bunch of it to be grass? What is a grass plant? Where does grass stop? Is it an edge? So grass it's in that weird territory between being a single thing and a collective thing that I think makes it very appealing to Whitman.
Mark, you've written about this so many times. The individual as part of a collective.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the poem Mackerel.
Mm-hmm.
Would you read that?
Oh, sure.
Time? Do we have time?
Yeah, yes, we do. It's
Because
putting.
this idea of the self, when he says, I celebrate myself, he doesn't mean his small individual self. He means the big self we all are part of, right? Or this self that so that there's this wonderful, he holds this paradox of being one, but being everyone, and being one, but of many, the way grass is. You can't, if you hold up one blade of grass, you're like, that's grass, I guess, but grass is the collective.
And you know, that word celebrate, in Whitman's day, it did not mean have a party or an anniversary. It meant to just like to say mass. It's
Yeah.
to celebrate.
It's a
So-
sacred tone to
Yeah.
it, right? I celebrate.
Okay, so here's a poem about the individual and the many. It's called The Display of Mackerel. They lie in parallel rows on ice, head to tail, each a foot of luminosity, barred with black bands, which divide the scale's radiant sections like seams of lead in a Tiffany window. Iridescent, watery prismatics. Think abalone, the wildly rainbowed mirror of a soap bubble sphere. Think sun on gasoline. Splendor, and not a one in any way distinguished from the other. Nothing about them of individuality. Instead, they're all exact expressions of the one soul, each a perfect fulfillment of heaven's template, mackerel essence. As if, after a lifetime arriving at this enameling, the jewelers made uncountable examples, each as intricate in its oily fabulation as the one before. Suppose we could iridesce like these and lose ourselves entirely in the universe of shimmer. Would you want to be yourself only, unduplicatable, doomed to be lost? They prefer, plainly, to be flashing participants, multitudinous. They don't, even now they seem to be bolting forward, heedless of stasis. They don't care they're dead and nearly frozen, just as, presumably, they didn't care that they were living. All for all, the rainbowed school and acres of brilliant classrooms, in which no verb is singular, where everyone is. How happy they seem, even on ice, to be together, selfless, which is the price of gleaming. That began in a Stop and Shop in Orleans, Massachusetts, when I saw this vision.
Is there anybody who hasn't talked who wants to talk back there in the dark? We can't see.
Yeah,
Yes,
we can't see
come.
you all back there.
Right here.
Hi. So you talk in your book about and reiterate how Whitman's work is so universal and not so, socially focused. And I wanted to ask you both as artists how you balance that in your work when there's so many like literal and figurative fires to put out here and talk about to people with,
Right.
and how you balance this like.
It's hard to get those words right through your mouth because you get the balance between what and what.
Of course. Okay. How you balance the kind of like sociopolitical effects of your art, the more immediate kind of conversations we need to have, and then conversations like Whitman's, which are so universal and huge.
Right.
Well, I think tell the truth, but tell it slant, Emily Dickinson said. So Mark reads a poem about mackerel, but it's so kindred in some ways to Whitman and to our social political problems, which come from believing that we're separate and that we're different from each other, and so we hate each other and don't cross this boundary and don't come into this country, and I own this and you don't. I mean, if we really do understand, I'm saying what we've already said tonight, but if you really believe that every atom belonging to me is good belongs to you, then we are the same person in some way. This notion of individuality, of course, has made Americans suffer for so long, suffer and create suffering. So I feel like it comes out. It looks like it's a poem about fish, right? But it's really a poem about fish. And what is the price of gleaming? Selflessness, you know?
You wouldn't know, too, that that poem was written really at the height of the AIDS epidemic,
Yeah.
when selves were something, individuals, something just disappeared right and left. And so people around me are vanishing. And I'm thinking, if a self can be gone like that, what was it? Was it here in the first place? It seems like mortality really calls into question what it is to be yourself. And that you wouldn't know that from the poem unless you got it in context of other poems that deal with this directly. And I keep feeling that I can't rest with just doing something directly. I need metaphor to give me another way in. So trying to, put those two things together. Trying to make a spectrum of the ways you can see the life around you,
Yeah. Alessandro, come. You come to me.
I have a question about death, because I think you touched upon the topic, and from what I understand, it's if we really accept the fact that every atom that belongs to me belongs to you, and we're all the same stardust at the end. So death almost becomes, as I think you
It's
said,
different from what anyone supposed. And
yeah,
luckier,
like a cycle,
right?
and so it's not a bad thing at the end.
Well, and then we could practice. I mean, that's what the Buddhists have been doing for thousands of years, right? Practicing giving up this notion of special individuality. And it doesn't mean that each one of us isn't lovable and interesting, but maybe death isn't what we expect maybe the death of the individual self isn't so terrible. And we have no idea what happens. I mean, Whitman, as Mark's book points out, he does wrestle with this later in his life. He suddenly sees, he goes, oh my God, the whole ground, it's like, it's fetid with the dead. It's just, he's overwhelmed. As one gets overwhelmed, I mean, at our age, a lot of our friends are dead because of AIDS and all sorts of other things. And you think, where did everybody go? But on the other hand, the smallest sprout shows there is no death. Everything comes back. The singularity, the crazy thing about the singularity is everything that is always was. There's no more stuff now than there ever was stuff. Like even it looks like we keep producing more stuff, but in fact, there isn't more stuff. It's the same stuff.
Just transforming.
Yeah.
So it depends a lot on the degree of distance you have. So
Yeah.
Whitman's at his most distant is when I think in his early poems where he's writing like this enlightened being.
He
and he's
really-
saying
he really-
everything
yeah.
is just flowing around me, and I am part of that, and the individual really doesn't matter very much. When you get down to less distance, then here's this beloved single person or animal in front of you, and like with my dog, I can't stand far enough back to say, well, he's part of the cycle of life, and his energy and his atoms will all go into the next thing, and that's just fine. That's as it should be. No, not my baby. But if I can move to that other point of view where it's such a glorious thing that he is full of this life and energy now, and that life and energy is sort of echoed and blended with all that's around him, and that's what we all are, I'm okay with that. But I don't think anybody gets to live at one place on this spectrum of distance all the time. We're all moving back and forth on it. So it's always tragic to lose what you love. And we also understand that if we can't decide to stop loving because we lose, So.
But as long as, I mean, this is what causes wars too, right? I mean, you know, my people, I love my people more than your people. And I mean, all that's got to stop. I mean, the great thing about the pandemic, if there is a great thing about it, is that finally, we might actually see ourselves as a planetary community, right? That we have to begin to see ourselves as a planetary community, not as individual, like this, the silence talking. I swear that was just received, you know. Birds fly over your maps and walls and always have, you know. These boundaries humans make, no other animals acknowledge. They're not there, right? We make boundaries. We say no further. We say, go back to Haiti. You know, you can't come into our country. Thousands of people having risked their lives, crossing rivers, dying, go back. You know, that's nonsense. But so that, but if I write a poem and say, nobody should have been sent back to Haiti. I mean, that's just rhetoric, you know? So how do we make it real to ourselves that we really are each other and that we're all gonna die and that everybody doesn't wanna suffer and everybody wants to be happy? How do we do this? We have to find other ways to discover it again and again ourselves. Whitman really, something happened to Whitman. I mean, something happened to Whitman. He had an enlightenment experience. I really believe he did. He saw into the truth of things, as some people are able to do. How do they live on after that? You know, it's like getting sober, you know. It's like that you know, you're sober and you're ecstatic, you know, for a long time, and then it's just, no, I don't drink, thanks anyway. I'll have a ginger ale. You know, it's just, it gets day by day, you know.
It was devastating for him later in his life because he said, you know, his early poems were written in a kind of trance and he could not will himself to return to it. He couldn't make that
they
out
were
again.
written, they wrote him, you know. And that's the thing. Art isn't, it doesn't come from us. I mean, it comes through us. So as long as we're full of opinions and rhetoric and stuff, it can go just into, you know, just the political right now. But how, if we try to open the aperture enough, something can come through that can tell us. I don't think we have very much to say, is what I'm trying to say. I think poetry has something to say, and it has something to say to the writer.
Really.
Question over here. Oh, Stormy, it's a question. Hang on. We have a question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, so far.
Okay. I feel as though I'm gonna struggle with these words, but being attuned to everyone belonging to a universal whole leads you to be somebody who leads with tenderness and sensitivity, because you care about everything as if it were yourself. But I feel as though those people who live that way are going to be more attuned to creating space for other people to speak and other things to grow. And when there are other people out there who are choosing to be less attuned to those things, I think they often find it easier to take up a lot of space and be loud, even if they don't really have anything they super want to say. And so how do you balance being sensitive and aware and attuned to holding space and also allowing all of the space around you to be held without getting like drowned out by the people who are consider that to be less valued?
That's a great question. And it speaks to me to the need that artists have to preserve their vulnerability, to remain permeable by experience. You know, that you could be entered by grief or by something you see or by an apparition, you know, can sort of take hold of you. That's necessary to us. But vulnerability also has its obvious downside, which is that it can paralyze you. During the worst of the lockdown, I live in Chelsea, and the people who were on the street were so profoundly wounded that to go to the grocery store was terrifying for me. I mean, just the speeches, the visible suffering, the hunger, the misery of living on the street, you know, was so plain. When you have a lockdown, the people that you see are people who don't have keys to anything. You know, people can't go anywhere. So it was just devastating. And to be sort of okay with that, what you have to do is have enough grounding in your own vision, your own sense of things, enough faith to go forward in your art. Because if you get swamped by your vulnerability, you're not doing yourself or anybody else any good, right? So you've got to somehow build a kind of enough faith to do your work, which is another way of saying courage, or enough of being in the present moment. So yes, you take in the caterwaults and the whales and the rage and the reef around you, and yes, you keep it at just enough distance to preserve yourself too. It's kind of an abstract answer, but I don't know how else to answer.
But you're also talking about evil, aren't you? I mean, you're really talking about people who will take over and be loud and make decisions. And I think this is a really difficult question. I mean, right now, I mean, of course, we act as citizens. We do what we can. We vote, we march, we do whatever we do. We're always citizens, of the world. And so we stand up for people who need standing up for. We speak for them as citizens. And it doesn't mean that doesn't come into our work. And it's hard to believe that the good will win out. I know, it's hard. But then you think of Mandela, in a prison cell for 26 years? And he walks out and becomes president of South Africa. Or, these miracles happen. And the thing in Whitman, he says in Song of the Open Road, I think I could stop here and do miracles. I mean, miracles happen. And to believe that miracles happen and to stand up for what's right, is part of the artist's job too. I just don't think that your work doesn't have to be overtly political, although I think both of us in some ways it is, but not, not rhetorical.
You don't know too how the smallest gesture you may make, the thing you say casually, or the conversation you have with someone that's just a short conversation for you, can change a life. I mean, poems change lives all the time. That'll solid poetry makes nothing happen is so not true, right? Yeah. Because people take these things to heart and find, even if it's a line or a phrase, that gives you hope, gives you a sense of possibility. That is not nothing, and that is enough to get you by sometimes.
Yes, and the good news here is that Mark will be with us all year, and Marie has reconnected to our community.
I love your community.
Yes,
so great.
And I thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And I thank our Zoom audience. I can see you looking beautiful out there in my imagination, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do they know about the next thing we're doing?
Yeah, okay, very briefly. Yes, they do know, but I don't know if our Zoom audience knows. But on November 17th, Mark will be in discussion with Madeline Olnick, who directed Wild Nights with Emily. And our students are going to have Hulu watch parties because we cannot gather in great multitudes. We can be multitudes, but we can't gather in multitudes. And so, and that's going to be amazing. So we're going to go from Whitman to Dickinson.
The two queer parents of American poetry.
Yes,
yes.
Yes.
What it is today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark and Marie. And thank all of you.
Thank you.